Martin Luther King's legacy to the black community was a legacy that might be defined in political terms, social and economic terms. Socially, he taught us to respect ourselves, to love ourselves. Politically, he taught us the importance of participation in politics and helped us to gain the right to vote in the Selma March in 1965. And economically, Martin Luther King contributed toward the escalation of black earning power from only $16 billion when he started out in Montgomery in 1955 to more than $180 billion in 1984. And I think when you add all of that up, Martin Luther King made it possible for black Americans to move into the mainstream of America's life and to be first-class citizens. He made it possible for me to be the mayor of Atlanta. Martin's legacy to the world was one of peace. He said that we are either going to have to learn to be nonviolent or we would be non-existent. He understood the tremendous potential of man to destroy the planet on which we live with nuclear weapons. And he understood that it was necessary and important for us to find ways to reconcile the enormous complexities of this world without violence, without warfare, without bloodshed. And I think that the kind of effort that he made in helping America to stop the war in Vietnam and the kind of call to peace that he gave to people all over the world, at home and abroad, means that the kind of progress that we have made in human rights and civil rights here is potentially possible for all citizens in a peaceful world. Martin Luther King, Jr. wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail in the midst of the Birmingham movement. He had just gone to jail when an ad appeared signed by a group of 7 distinguished white clergy. And that ad in the newspapers accused Martin Luther King of stirring up trouble and accused him of creating the difficulties and urged him to get out of town. Martin sat down and in the jail, and he didn't have any paper. He had, however, a newspaper. So he wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail around the margins of the newspaper. And when he ran out of newspaper, he started writing on the toilet paper in his cell. And he was so filled with the need to answer these charges, these spurious charges, that he set forth one of the most eloquent documents in American history. The letter from the Birmingham jail is something that every American, black or white, ought to take the time and read, because it says so much of what America is all about. And it says so much about the hopes for freedom and dignity of all American citizens. The Selma movement was a movement that secured and guaranteed the right to vote for all Americans. Prior to Selma, there were literacy tests, there were gerrymandering of districts, there was a whole scheme of obstructions that discouraged blacks from voting and that tried to neutralize or minimize the power of their vote. In Selma, Martin Luther King raised the question of the right to vote and laid the responsibility for ensuring and protecting the right to vote clearly on the federal government. And the 1965 Civil Rights Act guaranteed the right to vote for all Americans, not just blacks, but black and Hispanic. It also protected the rights of white Americans in ways that had not been protected. For there were places where literacy tests were used to discriminate against poor whites as well. And so I think that the fact that we are now approaching a level of democracy that allows all American citizens to participate in selecting their leaders, and the right to vote is now guaranteed by the federal government. I think we've got to say that the changes in American life, the war on poverty, the attempt to open up the educational opportunities and job opportunities, all came out of the Voting Rights Act. The creation of a program of affirmative action, the opportunity to get into the college of one's choice. All of those things were basically guaranteed by the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was an outgrowth of Selma. It was also an outgrowth of a continuing effort in Mississippi and the deaths of Andrew Goodman and James Chaney and Michael Schwerner. It was a product of the sacrifice and suffering of Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young Vietnam veteran who came back to Marion, Alabama, and was beaten to death by state troopers because he had been on a voting rights march. It's also the legacy of James Reeb, a Unitarian clergyman who was killed in an attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery. Of Viola Liuzzo, the wife of a labor union official who was driving people back from the march from Selma to Montgomery when she was shot by night riders and killed. And so many people suffered and many people died in order that the right to vote might be protected by the federal government. And I would think that Martin Luther King would want us to remember that and to realize that a price was paid so dear for this right that we should never waste that right to vote, but always use it wisely to determine our own destiny and to elect people whom we feel will adequately and honestly represent us in government. A national holiday in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is extremely significant to this nation. This nation has only recognized 2 Americans previously with national holidays. That's George Washington, the founder of our country, and Abraham Lincoln, who brought our country together, North and South, and reunited our country. Martin Luther King reunited our country racially, as Lincoln united our country geographically. He set us free of segregation and free of the burden of trying to live as 2 societies, one black and one white. And that was a liberation every bit as important as George Washington's liberation from the British. And I think the fact that the people of the United States, that the Congress of the United States, that the President of the United States signed into law legislation that honored the achievements of Martin's reuniting the country, or uniting the country, across racial lines, and that it puts him alongside the founding fathers of our nation, right alongside George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, as one who made a major contribution to the United States of America. But I think more significant than even George Washington or Abraham Lincoln is that Martin was the first of our national leaders to help our nation to achieve its goals without violence. He did not engage in the destruction of either person nor property. He decided that we could redeem the soul of America and that America could overcome racism and poverty and war without violence. In fact, he felt that violence only begat more violence, and that only nonviolence could help America really to redeem her soul. And so I think the significance of this holiday is a beginning realization that it's important for our country to be united across the lines of race and of class, and also that it's important for us to resolve our problems here at home, in our own families, and in the world at large, and to resolve them without violence. Martin Luther King was very sensitive to criticism. He felt that he was doing what was right. He felt as though he was following the will of God for his life. And it didn't bother him if people disagreed with him who were distant. It never bothered him that the Ku Klux Klan or that certain sheriffs disagreed with him. It did bother him when people whom he respected disagreed with him. It bothered him when the New York Times criticized him for coming out against the war in Vietnam. It bothered him when Robert Kennedy said, for instance, that leaders in the black community had been neglecting the North. He went north in some ways in response to criticism, because we were born in the South and we felt as though our responsibility was in the South. In truth, we didn't realize the seriousness of the problems of the North, and so we had neglected the problems of the North. We went north to try to demonstrate that the movement of nonviolence was equally as relevant in northern cities. Martin's decisions about the war in Vietnam, though, I think were hard to come by. In fact, he took over a year to reach that decision. He felt as though it was difficult to try to fight two battles, the battle of good race relations and the battle against the war in Vietnam. And for a long time, he encouraged Coretta to represent him at peace demonstrations. Or he asked Ralph Abernathy or me to go and speak in his behalf and represent him. But he didn't want to become the symbol of both movements. He thought that he could keep the two separate. But finally, I think a series of events happened that convinced him that he should change his position. One, he accidentally sat next to Dr. Spock on an airplane from Cleveland to New York. And they talked for a couple of hours, waiting for the plane and then on the flight en route. And he understood how sincere Dr. Spock was, but he understood also that Dr. Spock didn't know how to mobilize a national movement to end the war. And then not long after that, a young Buddhist monk came from Vietnam, and he came to express the point of view of that third force, that group of Buddhists that were neither supporters of the U.S. nor were they supporters of the Viet Cong, but simply people who wanted to be left alone in order to help their own country develop peaceably. And he listened to this young monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, describe and discuss the views of people of Vietnam, the Vietnamese. And I think that, as much as anything else, moved him to become publicly involved. And he felt as though the problems of our nation were being affected by the war in Vietnam. He said, the bombs you drop on Vietnam will explode at home in unemployment and inflation and other social problems. And he saw us draining our national resources by sending money abroad to fight a war that he felt was both unnecessary and unjust. And he decided that, as he said, he could no longer segregate his conscience, that injustice anywhere was a threat to justice everywhere, and that somehow America had to find another way to approach the question of Vietnam. Martin Luther King's character was molded by a strong family and a strong church. Daddy King and Mama King raised him to be a leader. He was standing up in front of the Sunday school making speeches when he was just a little tot. He was preaching in Ebenezer when he was in high school. His education was assured in that his parents had worked hard for education. In fact, Daddy King didn't graduate from college until he was almost 30. And he wanted more than anything else for his son to graduate from college and to go on to graduate school. And he knew the importance of that kind of quality education. And so I think out of those strong influences, the life and character of Martin Luther King was shaped. Morehouse College also, with Dr. Benjamin Mays, gave him a kind of role model for leadership, a kind of standard of excellence in his speech and in his study and his personal character. That was an important contribution toward leadership. But you have to remember that Martin's father was a preacher, but also his grandfather was a preacher. He was a product of the Black Baptist Church. His grandfather had been the treasurer of the National Baptist Convention and had preached from one end of this country to the other. His father was an outstanding evangelist and a civil rights leader before Martin was born. And so Martin represented a history and a heritage of people who were dedicated to the service of others and who were committed to doing something in behalf of the least of these, God's children. I think that that shaped Martin as much as anything else. He was also shaped by his life in the city of Atlanta, a city that was not only a city of churches and universities, but a city where he worked alongside the poor, where he studied with poor people, where he was forced to realize that the life that he lived was an exceptional opportunity that had been afforded him by the grace of God. That it was just a gift of God that he was born in this family instead of in another family where he might not have had educational opportunities, or good clothes to wear, or the kind of food that was on the table every day in his household. And he was very sensitive to those around him who were less fortunate. And he wanted to do something, even as a child, to help those around him to enjoy the kinds of life and blessings that he enjoyed. And I think that shaped Martin's character. And I think that those influences were profound influences on his life throughout his life. I don't think Martin Luther King ever felt that he was making a great personal sacrifice. He had been stabbed, he had been jailed, he had turned down jobs that offered him lots of money. But Martin Luther King felt that the most rewarding thing about his life was the opportunity to serve his nation and to serve his people. And I think he did that with no regrets. And he even made a joke about death, about his death and about the death of the rest of us. And he always said that if a man hasn't found something that he'll die for, he really doesn't know what he's living for. And he believed that it was important to believe in something so strongly that if required to, you would willingly give your life for that. And so I think Martin Luther King lived his life and enjoyed his life and did so with no regrets, because I think he found the true meaning of life. And that meaning of life is in service to others. He was concerned so much about those who had not had the opportunities that he had in life that he was literally willing to give his life for them. And when he approached a problem, he approached it totally. There was no, I'll try this out and then back off and see if it works or not. It was a commitment to do something about the life that the poor and black citizens of this United States shared with others. And I think that dedication to others, he was not concerned about money. He was not concerned about fame. It hurt him when people tried to distort his image or what he was trying to say or do. But he kind of understood that too as part of the price he would have to pay to move the society forward into a little better way of working with people. Martin was also a detailed tactician. He not only thought about the long-range goals, but he thought about the 1, 2, 3 steps that were necessary to get there. He started with Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Improvement Association, and his first task was to get out a mimeograph brochure announcing the boycott. And so he started with the kind of hands-on work of preparing a handbill for a mass meeting that launched the boycott. And he was always conscious of those kinds of things. If there was a mass meeting, he'd want to know, how many handbills did you get out? Where did you take them? How big is the church? And he was acutely aware of all of the little details of the movement, as well as the long-range goal and the big picture. He was also aware that you had to bring people together, that in the United States of America, it took 51% to be a majority, and that black people were only 11%. And so it was necessary in order to bring change. In fact, if we were going to have change at all, The task was not only to mobilize the 11% population, which is black. He had to mobilize 40% of the white population to join with them to create a majority. And I always say that Martin Luther King's primary goal and objective was not leading black people. Black people led him. He responded to the needs of black people, and he interpreted those needs to the white community. Black people knew what was wrong with segregation. They knew why it was unjust. He didn't need to convince them. He needed to convince the white population that segregation was unhealthy for the total society. And so in addition to mobilizing black citizens to do something for themselves and in their own behalf, he was acutely aware of the need in our society to build a creative majority. And he called that a coalition of goodwill. And he knew that people, black and white, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, and Muslim, would have to come together to make a majority that would truly redeem the soul of America and put an end to racism, poverty, and war. Martin Luther King was very concerned about his children. He loved his children, and he was very anxious about the fact that he was not able to spend more time with them. One of the reasons why he went home every weekend from almost anywhere we were in the country was that he felt as though it was important for him to be at church, in Ebenezer Church, with his family, and that at least one day he might have dinner with them and stay in touch with them. He believed that the quality of their life together had to be deep enough and serious enough and significant enough to overcome the fact that they didn't spend much time together. It's strange looking back on it now, but my first reaction was that he was kidding. We had been in his brother's room, AD's room, and I had just come back from a federal court hearing, and I had not called him all day long. And when I came in the room, he was fussing at me for not checking in. And I tried to give some lame excuse, and he picked up a pillow. And he started whipping me over my head with a pillow. And everybody was just so playful. We finally settled down and talked about what had gone on in the courts. And he was laughing and joking and went on up to his room to get ready to go out to dinner. And everybody was sort of clowning around. I was boxing with James Orange in the courtyard, and we heard what we thought was a firecracker. And my first reaction was that a car had backfired and Martin Luther King was faking and clowning and playing like he'd been shot. And he'd joke about things like that all the time. And it wasn't until I ran up the stairs and actually saw that half of his chin had been shot away and that he was laying there in a pool of blood that I realized that he was gone. And I knew instantly that he died almost, as soon as the bullet hit him, that he'd never probably even heard the shot. And my first reaction was that if anybody had earned the reward of a life with God, that he was certainly entitled to the peace that I think, as a Christian, comes with death. But then I began to get mad, and I began to get upset that he was going on to heaven to claim his reward, but leaving us with all his mess. And I didn't think we were adequate to the task. And yet, by the time we got him to the hospital and understood that he was dead, we came back and we gathered together in that same room. And we remembered all of the words that he had taught us, that the movement can never be built around one man, that no one man's life can stand in the way of the freedom of an entire nation. And we knew that it was our responsibility to carry on, and so we pledged our support to the Reverend Ralph Abernathy to go on to Washington to continue the Poor People's Campaign and to see what we could do to make sure that Martin Luther King's dreams became a reality. Ralph preached a wonderful sermon that next day when he said, quoting from the book of Genesis, when Joseph's brothers thought that he was dead, that you may kill the dreamer, but you can't kill the dream. I think the scripture says, here comes the dreamer, let us slay him, and we will see then what will become of his dreams. And so we kind of took seriously that challenge, and we understood that the dreams of Martin Luther King had to be carried on and had to be lived out in our lives, and that he had sent us, really, as he said, to the mountaintop. And even though he could not go with us to the promised land, he had promised us that the land was just on the other side, that we didn't have far to go. And so we were committed, I think, right then and there to carry on. If Martin Luther King were alive today, I think he would be tremendously impressed with the state of black America. That is, the majority of black America. He would be impressed that 70% of the black population is doing quite well in America today. But he would be very much concerned about the 30% that still lives on an island of poverty amid this ocean of American plenty. And Martin Luther King would want us to continue to use the political power that we now enjoy to do something about the plight of those who are homeless and those who are hungry, those who are jobless. He was always concerned about what happened to the least of these in our society. He reminded us that our society, or any society, is no stronger than its weakest links. And Martin Luther King, I think, would be very much concerned that the nation has destroyed or distorted its priorities. He would be concerned about a $200 billion military budget while people are homeless and hungry. He would be concerned about famine in Africa while we're giving weapons to nations that really are not solving their problems with those weapons, but only creating more weapons. And about apartheid, I think Martin Luther King would be an uncompromising foe of continuing racial injustice anywhere in the world. He always said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And Martin Luther King would be vigorously opposing apartheid in South Africa, and particularly America's economic and political support of apartheid. He would be an advocate, as he did in 1963, of sanctions against South Africa, because he would understand that sanctions essentially encourage people to do the things that they know they ought to do, but that they don't have the courage or the moral authority to do. And so, just as the Supreme Court in our nation forced us to do some things in the South that we didn't necessarily want to do, the role of sanctions internationally in South Africa is to help South Africa to put an end to apartheid and to begin to involve all of their citizens in the decision-making of that country. I think it's most appropriate for us to observe the holiday celebrating Martin Luther King's birth by trying to make our own lives a bit more loving, a bit more caring, a bit more concerned about those less fortunate, a bit more open to those with whom we disagree, a bit more understanding of those who differ. It's important for us to celebrate the nonviolent aspect of Martin's birthday, because I think history will record that as the most powerful contribution that he was able to make through his life.